There is a lot of landmines when it comes to renovations as well. And so, of course, as you get mature, you always start off small and then go and, do bigger and better things. You don't start off on $1 million renovation at the start because you might not have that eye for the detail. Hello and welcome to another episode of Help Me Buy Property Podcast. Today we are going to talk about, again, the same topic, 6 strategies to make 6 figures. And our subtopic or the episode is in relation to renovations. Now, before we dive in deeper, let me introduce my beautiful co-host, Miss Cheryl. How are you today, Miss Cheryl?
Hello.
Happy Tuesday.
Wow, what an intro. Beautiful in there as well. Well, I love this topic about renovations where we're talking about transforming ugly ducklings to beautiful swans, which my mother used to say I was. I stayed in the ugly duckling phase for a while. I'm still yet to convert. But this is what renovations is about, right? When people think of renovations, they're like, I buy this ugly dump and then I give it a whole makeover and ultimately you can create some incredible, equity and uplift from that. But Moss, maybe if you want to share your experience that you've had with renovations to begin with.
Sure. Look, I think ultimately renovation is the oldest trick in the book. And you think about renovations, it's the quickest and the easiest way to add or manufacture equity in your personal portfolio. Let's talk about the good side and the bad side with renovations, right? The good side with renovations, of course, is when you're thinking about renovations, there is multiple strategies, and we'll go down that level of detail as well. The traditional residential renovations and dual income or yield grab renovations and commercial renovations. But if you take a step back and think about what a good renovation naturally means, a good renovation naturally means where you are spending less money, but you're getting a bigger return out of it. And so a typical example would be for one of the renovations that I did for a house that I purchased for around $420,000, spent about $15,000 on it. The bank valued at about $550 from memory, rented at about $450 per week. Typical example of a renovation, right? Uplift, hold. I'm not selling it because this is a development site. So, multiple exit strategies in place. But ultimately, that's what you want. A lot of the renovations is not always about selling. Sometimes it's about development, but sometimes it's about holding, where you are uplifting, grabbing the money out and redoing it again.
Yeah.
And so can be really tricky as well. But, the uplift of the equity side of things is something that every renovation should offer. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And we're talking about renovations. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to be knocking down walls all the time. I mean, really, really effective renovations can be just cosmetic things like changing the color of the house or just refreshing the roof and cleaning up the front of the garden. I think the thing about renovations is because it is very doable and achievable for most people, it's a very attractive strategy. And the fact that you don't have to necessarily go through planning. If there's no structural work that's involved, it is as long as you've got some, a bit of a keen eye around what looks good.
Yes.
Also, things like you could add a wall internally that's not a load-bearing wall, obviously it doesn't structural, that can add another room and suddenly you've turned a 3-bedroom into a 4-bedroom. And where does that take your value? That increases the value. So
100%.
I really like, and you're not risking from a risk perspective. It is low risk because the asset is still there. The asset still holds its value. And the banks like it more because you're not knocking down something to rebuild something new. And, fingers crossed, we don't have issues like we have with builders where you've got builders sort of, dropping like flies, touch wood. Whereas with a renovation, you've got less of a concern around that. You might have issues with trades, but, you're not having to deal with a large construction agreement in that regard. So yeah, those are the things I think are the pros about renovations. There's there's a lesser risk. You can do it. It's a quicker turnaround. That often as well, if you can structure it with and being really creative, like getting early entry clauses where you can start to go in and measure up and all of that before you even settle as well. So there are a lot of really creative things you can do around renovations.
I think the floor plan definitely means everything when it comes to renovation. I think, even when I was buying a house for my own self, I did the whole renovation job there. The first thing as an astute renovator or a professional renovator does is always walk through the house and looks at the floor plan and say, okay, does it have too many livings? Can I convert this into some way, shape, or form into a much better living experience? Is the kitchen open living? Is it a tight kitchen? Can I drop some walls which are not load bearing and, open the space up and create bedrooms? I think ultimately the most important thing from a renovations perspective is work within the boundaries of the house that is already there. Every time you do an extension or what we call it is major renovations, you're adding significant cost to it. Now, some renovators do that, and there's nothing wrong with that. Ultimately, what you need to realize is that the major difference between a renovation and a small scale development is from a cash perspective, they might require similar sort of money because, developments, can be $250,000 to $300,000, right? The quicker turnaround time, while lower profits, but easier exit is something that is really, really attractive for people. Also, let's not forget, right? A lot of people who are professional renovators, they tend to use that, again, caveat, speak to your tax accountant. The tax discounts in relation to moving into a property, uplifting, the value of the property, doing renovations themselves, being hands-on, laying the tiles, redoing the bathroom, doing the paint themselves. So, time is naturally money that they're converting into money, and then flipping it, not paying any taxes and doing it again. Of course, you do it multiple times and, it's almost a business enterprise. So you need to be careful, but that's the biggest sort of bang for the buck when you think about traditional residential renovations. You can mix this strategy with development as well. I've seen this in splitters typically, right? Where, you buy an ugly house with good bones, you save the house at the front, build one or two at the back, but you renovate the house at the front by spending minimalistic amount of money and lifting the value up. And again, you can bring the two strategies together. Instead of one six figure, you're making multiple six figures there, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I'd like to share, just today as well, if I can name drop as also, I was chatting with Joel and Bianca from 𝐬𝐿 Property, who are based in the Sunshine Coast. So they're my neighbors now. And we were talking about the exact strategy around doing a renovation in the front house and sort of subdividing, building a secondary dwelling in the back. However, we're actually combining, and I love stacking strategies. So we've talked about rooming before. The house in the front, we're actually converting into rooming.
Oh, perfect.
So
Awesome.
you're doing a renovation, so there's uplift there. But then you're doing rooming, where then you're increasing the rental return on the properties.
Yes.
At least 2.5 times in that regard, 3 times. And so, like you said, you don't have to necessarily sell these renovation projects. Like, you're keeping that's high cash flow in this regard. Then it gives us another block at the back.
Yeah.
Then do the same thing. So
100%.
If you talk about, we talked about 6 different strategies, but this is
Probably the 7th.
How many strategies is there? Like, it's multiple strategies in one. So you're stacking strategies there.
100%. I think there was a property that has hit my desk today that we are buying for a client today, and that's exactly the same sort of the work. There is a house at the front that has been slightly renovated. It's a 1,000 square meter lot, and you could potentially build a rooming house at the back. And I was like, wow, this is just amazing, right? So you can carve up the place, build something at the back, subdivide it, build something at the back, ultimately lift up the yield. And so I think this was priced at, from memory, about $450,000. You can carve up the balance of the land and sell that for $300,000, and you would have $150,000, $200,000, in loan for the front house, which would be renting at probably like $550 per week, right? And that's just, it's just a smart way to, carve, get the money, reduce the LVR, go back in and do it again, right? So these strategies are amazing, and you can mix and match them, and it's a perfect sort of opportunity. I think one thing that we need to dive a bit more deeper into is renovating in the luxury space. You can talk about renovations, that cost $600 to $1 million, same as, building a brand new house, right?
Yes, yes.
And so why do those renovations work? Let's talk a bit about that, Cheryl.
Yeah, and I'll share in our the experience that we've had, where in those situations where I found it, we had to go through a DA process, so it was quite major renovations. However, you are creating, whether it's extra rooms or extra space, particularly when, I mean, we used to live in Sydney, so you have houses that are a bit smaller, terraces or whatever. They end up, they might only have 2 bedrooms, and then you do a major renovation where you're adding 3 bedrooms, and then all of a sudden you've created a 5-bedroom mansion type thing. Like, it increases the value significantly. However, then also creates a product which is fairly unique and new in an area which might not be a particularly new area. So it becomes incredibly when you're talking about that, then yes, there is a higher level of risk, I see, because you have to deal with planning. You got to deal with sort of larger construction timelines and costs. So there's potential for sort of blowouts as well.
Definitely.
And sometimes you do look at it, you have to weigh it up, depending on the extent of the renovation. Is it actually cheaper for you, or is it actually better value to knock down and rebuild?
Yeah.
Also.
Yeah. And you make an amazing point. I think a lot of people, when they think about renovation, they always tend to overcapitalize because they see themselves living in the house, and they see themselves, with all these, extra bells and whistles that they want in the house. Renovation is all about the maximum value for the minimum spend. It's not so much about, oh, I need a super energy efficient home with all the AI stuff. That's not what renovation is about. Renovation is about, for every dollar that I'm spending, am I getting 10x back, 15x back, 20x? What does that X looks like, from a renovation perspective? And so naturally your thinking always is, even if I change this shower head or this basin, do I need to? Would it add any value? Would the buyer walking through the house appreciate this and be emotionally attached to this bloody toilet seat, right? And pay me an extra money, right? That's what a renovator truly thinks about. And so I've seen people numerous number of times going through this cycle of emotionally getting attached themselves and overcapitalizing. I have a typical example of this particular guy that I spoke to. Beautiful property, amazing price point that he bought, and he should have not spent more than $60,000 on the property, but ended up spending about $120,000, right? And then he brings it out to the market thinking, oh, wow, it's such a wow house. And people are like, well, I can buy a brand new place for that sort of money. So why would I pay you similar amount of money, right? And so you need to understand that while your renovation may look brand new, feel brand new, people have interest in the house, that everyone can see when the house was bought and what the old pictures look like. And if you are doing a quick and dirty renovation within 6 months or 3 months or 2 months, there is always this sense of conservatism that, it must be a bought job, or, they might have just done it on the face value cosmetically. They might not have gutted the house completely. And so, that would take away the price. And so people would not pay through the heart in some of these areas, So you need to understand that, there is a price discrepancy when you compare a renovated site to a brand new site.
Yeah, absolutely. And so let's talk about, I guess, some of the cons or the things to look out for. With renovations, like you said, there's the chance of budget blowouts. Just with any of our projects, like there's always budget blowouts. But the truth is, like in the current market, that is more and more likely to happen because your labor costs have gone up, or your material costs have gone up. Yes, it's stabilized. However, it is, cost is going up. So if you are able to find ways to reduce those costs and keep within the budget, then we talk about making sure it's feasible. Stick to that as closely as possible. Also, sort of spending, like you mentioned, more spending where it's needed. not thinking that when you're doing a renovation that you need to change every single thing. So depending on the price point of what you're selling, are you able to paint over tiles or whichever? And I'm not a renovation expert in any sense. There are definitely a lot more people who are more experienced than I am, but there are simple things around, you don't necessarily have to change a whole kitchen. Potentially it's changing the cabinetry doors or changing the handles. So, what are the simple things that you can do to update something without blowing the
Definitely.
budget?
And ultimately, also, you need to consider that, it's not just about putting brand new. A lot of the renovators have this idea of, okay, buying it from a demolition house where they have a beautiful kitchen and they would repurpose some of that stuff as well. So controlling the cost is definitely on the top radar. You need to understand what your costs look like. Again, doing the numbers on the paper, making sure that it works, right? I think a lot of people, again, the similar sort of the case with development sites, would crunch the numbers at the back of a tissue paper, right? And then be like, oh yeah, the numbers work. They wouldn't consider things like on cost or holding cost or, or the things of the unknown, right? The contingencies. You don't know when you got the place, you might find termites, right? I have a beautiful friend who does a lot of renovations in Queensland. And he used to basically focus on a lot of these flooded houses. And so he knew exactly what to look for. He knew exactly what to change for. And, that experience gave him that idea of, okay, what needs to go, what needs to replace, what should be brand new, what should be old is fine. So it's understanding that it's not about expensive, it's about making it look expensive, right? It's not about, having a marble benchtop or granite benchtop. It's about making it look like it's an expensive area. That wow factor is what's going to drive the emotions out of the buyer, and getting them to pay through the heart rather than through their mind. So
Yeah.
yeah,
And going back to some of the things to look out for, because we are finding, because the renovation space is quite competitive and owners are more cluey as to, there's not that huge discrepancy between an unrenovated and a renovated property. So what's really important is that you're mindful of the transaction costs, the going in and coming out of the project. When you're doing your feasibility, it's making sure you're aware of those costs, and then also then the tax implications as well. So maybe you wanted to share a little bit about some of those types of costs we got to.
yeah, definitely. Look, I mean, the quicker turnaround, while it's great, it's also important that you don't get to use the 50% discount rule, because you're not holding that for more than 12 months. And so anything that you make, if it is a business enterprise, is up for the grabs, right? And so if you are already on a highest tax bracket, naturally 50% or 45% is up for grabs by the taxman, right? So you need to have the right structures in place. Don't just go out starting doing it in your own personal name. Also always allow for your own time that you've spent on the renovations, right? A lot of people that I see who do renovations would never factor in their own labor, right? If you're laying the tiles yourself, or if you're laying the floor yourself, or changing the carpets yourself, or doing the paint yourself, well, that's your labor, right? So you need to allow for some of these things. This is part of the transaction cost, and you can't just assume that this cost would not be considered, because that's the sweat equity that you're putting in there. So yeah, there is a lot of potholes, or there is a lot of landmines when it comes to renovations as well. And so, of course, as you get mature, you always start off small and then go and, do bigger and better things. You don't start off on $1 million renovation at the start, because you might not have that eye for the detail. You might not be creative. You might be a colorblind like me, right? You can't distinguish between
Now you tell me.
yeah,
Yeah,
red and yellow. So
that's what my builder said when we went to look at tiles. We went through a whole hour of picking out tiles. He goes, "Oh, by the way, I'm colorblind." I went, "Could you have told me this earlier? Like when we started?"
so
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. I think you need to have that creative bone in you to come up with the renovation and picture what the perfect property is going to look like. And I think that's very, very important as well. Now, my thinking always from a renovation perspective is always pack it with another strategy, not just do the renovation by itself, because the transaction cost majority of the time is the killer to the deal. You add stamp duty, you add holding cost, you add all of these things to it, and usually the deal becomes, marketing costs, selling costs, etc. The deal becomes not so enticing. And so if you do that to grab the yield or increase the yield and grab the equity uplift, then that would be a perfect strategy for you to replace and replicate again and again. I think the last thing that we should touch on is commercial renovations, right? I think commercial renovations is an interesting one. Do you have any experience, Cheryl, or do you want me to talk a bit about the commercial?
No, you talk about it. It's not an area that I have a lot of experience with. I've spoken to different people about it before, that in that commercial space, but feel free to share yours.
See, from my perspective, I've never done a commercial renovations, but I've spoken again, and I'm sharing the experiences of some of my really good friends who have done this in the past. And it's a very interesting way the renovations work in the commercial world. And so we all know that commercial properties are driven by the valuations of the yield. And so the renovations in a commercial property is always there to push the yield up. And pushing the yield up naturally pushes the price up. And so you see old dirty looking warehouses and people would come in and put a brand new floor or give it a lick of paint or add a subfloor. And, all of a sudden the gross floor area goes up and the more usability goes up, or, they provide this extra office space, for example, within a warehouse. And every little bit of yield counts. You're adding an extra 50 to 100 to, even sometimes, $500 to these commercial properties rentals, and the valuation goes up. And naturally, that, with commercial valuations, because they're driven by yields, they instantly give you the equity back. If you take it back to the market, a commercial agent would look at the yields and say, oh, yeah, this is what the yield was previously. This is what the yield is now. The cap rate remains the same. Here is the new deal, or here's the new money that you can get. And so it's a very interesting dynamics. Of course, there is bigger costs involved in commercial, but it's a lot more simpler than what I feel the residential renovations are. You're not looking for pretty, you're not looking for picture perfect. You're just adding the yield, and you're thinking more about efficiencies. You're thinking more about value in relation to, the space, the active space that you're creating for people to use more. So it's very interesting. I find that, people can create a lot of value in commercial renovations as well.
Yeah, and I've heard, even adding sort of a usable mezzanine space, for example. So it is an area, like I said, I don't have a lot of experience in. However, I've spoken to various people about it. And, it'd be great if we've got our audience who have done commercial renovations to sort of share their experience as well. But again, what we're trying to highlight here is that renovations don't just need to be in that residential space. There's commercial renovations, there's probably industrial renovations too. But to think, because again, there's so much more competition, to think laterally and to stack strategies, because there's less margin to be made in renovations, like a simple renovation now, because so many people are across it. So you've got to be a bit more creative in how you're doing it.
Yes. Also, one thing that I do want to touch with you, and I'm sure that you would have, some sort of exposure to this, Cheryl, is more in relation to, people buying these renovations on cash. You would always see that happening, that, these old houses are always bought on a very low LVR or a very, very low cash or very high cash amount. Talk to us as a bit about that, as to, why some of those deals happens in a much shorter settlement times, much quicker turnaround times.
I find that really interesting. And so what you're saying, from what I understand, it's like, why are people putting like 100% of their cash in?
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah. And I do ask the question as well. I'm the type that likes to be able to leverage.
Yes.
And so, and it could well be, and I can't speak for why other people do it, it could well be that they just feel, in terms of the transaction costs and the time to get a loan, it's going to take longer. I don't really know. I like to be able to use.
It's very interesting. I've always sort of thought this through. I've spoken to a few renovators, and look, they've never given me a suitable answer as to why would they not use debt to their advantage. Yes, there might be valuation shortfalls because the house might be really, really old, but then again, you would not be overpaying for these houses anyway, So maybe it's the speed of the deal, maybe it's a deceased state or something along the lines, and they want a quicker settlement or something like that. I don't know. But it always surprises me when people buy houses of cash just for renovation and then flipping it. Yes, it reduces your holding cost 100%. I don't disagree. But ultimately, your cash on cash returns becomes quite smaller, right? So you need to think about the cash on cash returns and not just, reducing the holding cost. And so, yes, do better cash flows, rather than not taking debt at all, right?
Yeah,
So,
yeah, that's right. So, like I said, I it's not something that it wouldn't quite work for me. But I mean, there are people doing it and they do it well. Then fantastic for them. But I like to be able to leverage the money.
definitely. Let's wrap this up, Cheryl. Parting words for people who are looking to get into renovations and creating a six-figure through this strategy.
Absolutely. My parting word, and it's going to be a really short one, is don't forget to surround yourself with your A team. We've talked about this in our previous episodes, like your A team, whether it's the real estate agent who understands what the needs are and can give you some values around that, a property manager as well, understanding the rental yields you can get from a renovated property, your plumbers, your electricians, like all these people that your trades that you're going to leverage to be able to make sure that they can give you quick quotes, and that to make sure that you're going to be working within your budget as well. Like leverage these people in your renovations, just like any other investment or development. Create your A team, make sure you're leveraging them, make sure you're giving them business as well, and they're going to look after you.
Definitely. Beautiful words, Cheryl. My parting words, if I very quickly summarize this as well, is understanding why a person would pay premium for a fully renovated house. It's important to understand that people usually have money to buy a house. They don't have cash, or they have enough deposit to just buy a house. They don't have enough money to buy a house and then use more money to renovate it. It's not a typical scenario. People usually sit with 20% deposit. They don't have an extra $200,000 or $300,000 on top to renovate the house, or even $50,000 to $100,000 in some instances. And so from their perspective, if they just have to cough up 20% of whatever that price looks like, that number is significantly lower, while you are the one bringing the cash in, doing the uplift, doing the renovations, and charging bigger money. And that's where the value is created by the renovator. It's using your cash to add value. And so that mindset should never change. Always think about the amount of money that you're putting in, and the cash and cash return that you're going to get out of that deal would ultimately be the deciding factor of you continuing to do it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well said.
Awesome. Well, thank you for listening to us, viewers and listeners. Again, if you are someone who has done commercial renovations, please drop it into the comments below. Reach out to us. We would love to talk to you and, pick up your brain. If you have done renovations in the past, and if you want to share your experience, please, drop it into the comments below. Share your story on Help Me Buy Property podcast. Keep smiling. Take care. Keep investing. This is Moss and Cheryl checking out.
Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.